In this video, we'll be talking about how to close the founder to CEO skill gap. Hi, my name is Victor Chang. I'm an executive coach, founder of SaaSceo.com, and the author of the book Extreme Revenue Growth. And today what I'll be talking about is answering this one particular question. What separates the founders in startups that make it to CEO as the company grows and scales versus those that don't? It's a big issue in our field. A lot of private equity firms confide in me that they're frustrated that half of their founders that they invest in need to be removed as the company grows because they can't rise to the occasion and become the CEO that the business needs at that level. They don't want to remove the founder, it's just they're not effective anymore. A lot of founders are very concerned that if they raise outside capital, they're going to lose control of their business and lose their job and sort of separating from the baby that they started. Right? So this is an issue everybody talks around. But nobody talks specifically about what is the concrete difference between founders that can make it to CEO versus those who cannot. I call this difference the founder to CEO skill gap. Being a founder has a certain set of skills. Being a CEO, whether a founder that rises to CEO or being hired as an outside CEO, has a different set of skills. And I want to talk about what those differences are and how you can, if you want to, close the gap from a founder to being a CEO. Founders have a lot of strengths. They tend to be visionary, they're great at being innovative, they have passion, they're frugal with capital, and they really champion the company culture. They're fabulous at that. CEOs are quite different. Their skills are focused around what I call scale relevant skills. At $1 million in sales, that's one kind of business. At 30 million in sales, that's a different kind of business. And CEOs have skills that become increasingly relevant as the company gets bigger. They tend to be more structured, very disciplined. So there's a time and place for all these skills. And what I want to talk about today is how do you close these two skill gaps? Best companies with the highest valuations, the highest return on investment for their investors are those founders that are able to rise to the occasion and close that founder to CEO skill gap. Now, the premise of my talk today is that to scale your revenues, you must scale your skills as the leader of your company. It's just not realistic to expect your business to double, triple, quadruple in size when your skill level doesn't change during that entire time. Right? So that's the premise of our talk today. So let's dive into it. The founder to CEO skill gap. There are about a dozen skills that founders lack and need to learn on their path to becoming CEO. I'm going to talk today about the four most common skill gaps that I see most often in the founders that I work with. Skill gap number one is the decision-making approach. Founders and CEOs make decisions quite differently. Let me explain. Founders tend to be visionary, intuitive, and opportunistic. So when a founder goes into a brand new market that has not yet emerged with a brand new company, there's nothing to see. Right? It's literally a blank piece of paper external to the company. And if you look at the company's metrics, there are no metrics because the company doesn't yet exist. Right? So you really need at this stage vision. You got to see what's possible, what's going to emerge in the marketplace and get ahead of it. And you want to see what's possible within your company and get ahead of that. So a lot of sheer determination, vision, and willpower, super, super important in the early stage. Plus great intuition. There's nothing to analyze, right, in an emerging market and in a brand new company. So founders need to be intuitive and they need to be opportunistic because you don't yet know what is going to work. So you have to try lots of different things. So founders tend to say yes, yes, yes. They see an opportunity, they go after it. That's their instinct. CEOs, however, are a little bit different. They're much more pragmatic. They don't care as much about changing the world as making the quarter. Right? They're much more data-driven. And if you think about it, it makes sense. As you get into the mid-7 figures, and especially as you get into the 8 and 9-figure businesses, there's a lot more data that to be analyzed. And CEOs as a group, tend to be much better at analyzing data. And that's important because as the business grows, it's too hard to manage just by looking around and looking over people's shoulders, which is what a lot of founders typically are used to. And finally, CEOs tend to be much more strategic. And what I mean by that is strategy is about making trade-offs. You can't do everything. There is an opportunity cost to every decision. Every yes means many different no's. So CEOs as a group tend to be much better at saying no. They say no to a lot of things in order to say yes to the one or two things that are going to make the biggest difference. the key point here is neither that one is better than the other. It's more that as a business grows, the skill sets needed to run that size business evolves over time. Early on, you want the visionary, intuitive, and opportunistic thinking. Later on, you want practical decision making that's very data driven and strategic, being very mindful of the trade-offs. So let me give you a quick case study. I had a client, classic founder, started 3 businesses, was starting the 4th business, and had plans in mind for the 5th and 6th business. Right? Asked me to help and said, hey, I want your help in running these businesses better. And so I asked for some data, right, around these different businesses so we can make a data-informed decision. So sort of teaching him CEO level skills as we were going through this process. And what was really fascinating, this really epitomizes this difference between founder and CEO. The business that he was most excited about was the brand new business that doesn't exist yet, right? Because he's a visionary. He sees things that others do not see. And the business he was least excited about was the one that was the biggest. And what was happening was this business was about $10 million a year in sales, and it had a net revenue retention rate of about 140%. And what that means is that if you take all the customers in January of a calendar year, kind of add up how much they spent, and you look at those exact same customers 11 months later in December of the same calendar year, you compare how much they spent. And so in a business with 100% net revenue retention, they spend the same amount. So he had a business that turned out had 140% net revenue retention. And funny thing was, when I asked him what his numbers were, he didn't know. He had to go take a couple days to go calculate it. And he emailed this to me. And when I heard this number, I was shocked, because 140% net revenue retention is fabulous. If you look at the companies in SaaS in particular, software as a service, the companies worth over $1 billion a year, $1 billion in market cap, often have 140% net revenue retention. And so I just did the math very quickly, because CEOs do math, they do calculations. And what I realized was his $10 million a year business was going to hit $100 million a year in roughly 8 years, assuming adding no new customers and assuming that 140% net revenue retention stayed constant. And this was a big revelation for him. He did not realize that he has a business that is going to have an enterprise value, probably north of $500 million in under a decade. And so this really epitomized the difference between a founder thinking and CEO thinking. And after I did the math with him, he got really excited about owning a business that was going to exceed $100 million a year in about 8 years. And that could be sped up by adding salespeople, spending more time operating the business. I think the business had 1 or 2 salespeople, and this founder was spending probably a half a day a week running this business. And so now that he saw the opportunity, he was super excited to invest more in that business. So this is a classic example of the difference between founders and CEOs. And here's the key takeaway in all this. As companies grow, CEO-type decision-making becomes increasingly important and eventually essential. At a certain size, it's too hard to manage the business purely on intuition. You don't see everything in the business. There's multiple locations, there's multiple teams, there's multiple layers of management that people report to the people that report to you, right? Or maybe more layers. And it becomes too complicated. And the skill set of managing through data becomes an essential part of the CEO's skills. The second skill gap is what I call process maturity. Let me define what I mean by that. A process is the steps taken to achieve a task or complete a task inside of a company. So answering the telephone, that your receptionist answers the phone, is a process. You pick up the phone, you say, hello, how may I direct your call? So that's an example of a very simple process. Now, all processes in a company, every piece of work, whether it's doing quality assurance for software, generating the leads, closing a deal, onboarding a customer, all those processes can be graded on a scale of immature versus mature, right? So I call this the process maturity curve. Immature on one end and mature on the other end. And so a classic example, just to sort of illustrate the point, would be the example of an artist. An artist is supremely talented at producing their work, right? Which is like Leonardo da Vinci. There's one Mona Lisa. He's clearly an artist. But it's very immature from a process standpoint, because Leonardo da Vinci cannot train other people to be like him, right? It's too difficult. That process doesn't scale very well. On the other end is a factory, such as a poster printing factory, right? Where you can train people to print out more posters of the Mona Lisa. It scales much better. So the key point here is that processes that are mature scale. Processes that are not do not scale. And the key insight here is you want to turn your SaaS business into a factory of sorts that produces annual recurring revenue, really attractive gross margins, and very high customer retention rates. So if you think about your business as a factory, right, on the input side of the business, you're taking an executive team, a product, a go-to-market function like sales and marketing, and various mature processes, ideally, and capital to produce an output, right? All factories have inputs, they do something with the inputs, and they produce an output. And in the SaaS business, those outputs are annual recurring revenue, gross margins, retention, very high net promoter scores, very happy customers. So inputs on one end, outputs on the other end. So your objective is to turn your SaaS business into a factory of sorts that produces annual recurring revenue, gross margin, and high customer retention. Especially doing so in a way with very consistent and predictable input to output ratios. So a factory that prints posters knows how much ink they need, how much paper they need to produce how many units of the poster at the other end of the factory, right? Every factory has an input to output ratio. So in a SaaS business, you have inputs are your people, your capital, right, and your product, and the output are all these financial metrics. So for example, when you know that you can spend $1 million on sales and marketing and generate $2 million of annual recurring revenue at 90% net revenue retention, and you've done it 4 quarters in a row, super consistent, you have a factory or a mature processes in your SaaS business. Okay? So question next is, how do you determine if you have mature processes? How do you evaluate that? Well, the answer is there's a process for that, as you might imagine. So what I do is I like to score processes or grade them on how mature or immature they are. And what I use is this process maturity scorecard that I've created to rate every process in a business from 0 to 6. And so here are the key criteria. There are 6 factors, and if you answer to the column on the right, then you give yourself 1 point. If your answer is closer to the column under immature, then you don't give yourself any points, right? So 5 and 6s are very mature processes, 0s are very immature processes. So let's look at each factor one at a time. So number 1, consistency of results. Whether this is your product development team, your DevOps, your marketing, your sales team, your customer retention team. If your results are very consistent, there's a very high likelihood that you have a very mature process. So give yourself 1 point. If you're inconsistent, no points. The second factor, person dependency. So for example, in your customer onboarding department, does the success of those customers being onboarded vary a lot based on which specific individual in the department is doing the work? If it doesn't matter who does the work and you still get great results, then you're person independent. Give yourself 1 point. If there's high volatility, that if Mary does the onboarding work compared to Bob, the customers that get onboarded by Mary do a lot better, right? If there's that difference in discrepancy, that's a person-dependent process and therefore is less mature, so 0 points. The third factor is documentation. How do you onboard a customer? If the process by which you get work done resides in a few people's heads, that's an immature process because a new employee cannot come on board and read the documentation on how to do something and start being productive. They make too many errors because they don't know what to do. So if you have a documented process, give yourself another point. Number 4, new employee training. Is new employee training done by apprenticeship? Hey, just join us, follow me around for 6 months, you'll eventually figure it out, and then just do what I do. That's an apprenticeship training model. 0 points. A more mature training model is to train people based on curriculum. These are the 15 things we do in this role. We're going to teach it to you, we're going to have you practice it, and we're going to do proficiency testing at the end of training to see if you got it. And then we're going to have you do your work with a supervisor who's going to watch you do your work and coach you in the first several weeks here. That's a more mature process. 5th, the skill level required. Immature processes require a very high level of skill of the employees that are hired. Right? Very mature processes can require a lower level of skill. And we'll talk more about this in a second. If you have a lower level of skill needed to be effective, then give yourself another point. And finally, decision making. If decision making is tied to one specific person, such as you, the founder, or one specific person, the head of a department, and every decision is a judgment call, that is an immature process. That is a telltale sign of an immature process. On the other hand, a mature process looks like this. 80 to 90% of decisions are driven by policies, decision-making guidelines, criteria, and checklists. When all that decision-making can be externalized out of one person's head, and you still get the same decision as a subject matter expert would, you have a much more mature process. Let me give you a quick example. Years ago, I had clients in a wide variety of fields. I had this great fortune of having clients that owned a graphic design firm. And their marquee client was McDonald's. And they were hired to revise the Hamburger University training curriculum for new franchisees that would then later be used to train new employees at a new McDonald's location. And McDonald's had a very interesting requirement of my former clients. They were to revise the McDonald's training manual at Hamburger University, but they could not use any words in any known human language on earth. And so what they had to do was rewrite the entire training curriculum on how to make a Big Mac using just graphics and pictures and pictograms. In other words, the Hamburger University curriculum became a lot more like an IKEA product assembly manual. And I don't know why McDonald's asked them to do this, but I have some suspicions. My suspicion was they were running into a labor shortage problem. To work at a McDonald's, you need employees that can follow instructions and read, right? Read the instructions so they can follow them. And they were running out of people. So by taking the training curriculum and removing the literacy requirement, whether that's English or Korean or Swahili, you have the ability to take people who had a lower skill level and still have them be effective at making Big Macs. Lower skill level means a high level of process maturity. So that's an example of making a process more mature. My second example or case study is looking at how different kinds of businesses think about revenue. So in the software field, when a business reaches, say, $80 million a year in recurring revenue, there's a name that gets associated with that achievement. It's called a unicorn. So a unicorn is a business with a market value of over $1 billion. And so as you sort of hit that $80 million mark, people start using that term a lot to describe that kind of business. And the unicorn is just like this monumental achievement. You've reached the pinnacle of your career as a founder if you've run a unicorn business. Now, in contrast, Starbucks has a very different word when their business achieves $80 million in revenue. That word is just another Tuesday. You see, Starbucks generates $80 million in sales every single day of the year. You never hear about it in headlines. The reason why is because it's routine. It's not a heroic effort to generate $80 million in a single 24-hour period. They do it every day. It is routine. In fact, it's boring. Right? So the difference here is process maturity. Starbucks has a process to manage all 360,000 employees they have across how many countries, I have no idea, to produce $80 million in sales every single day. That's a high degree of process maturity. All right, let's talk about 3 ways you can acquire process maturity in your business. Number 1 is you can hire leaders with process expertise. If you take outside capital, one of the first things your investors will insist that you do is to fill leadership gaps. If you don't have seasoned people in all the key functional areas, they're going to make you hire them, recruit them to round out the team. One of the reasons is because new leaders, especially those that have experience at the next 1 or 2 stages of growth that you have not yet achieved, when they have that kind of experience, they bring with it process maturity. So how do you manage a 100-person software development team is quite different than how you manage a 5-person software development team. The amount of coordination, standardization, policies, and procedures required is very, very different and much more complicated as you get bigger. Same is true with marketing, same is true with sales, same is true with legal. Every functional area gets more complicated as you grow. So outside leaders have that process expertise. Second way to acquire a process maturity is to outsource. If you don't have a great process for doing something, You want to ask yourself, can I just rent somebody else's process instead? So for example, cutting payroll checks. If you're not really great at running a payroll process, why not hire or outsource to like an ADP? They've cut billions and billions of payroll checks. They're really, really good at it. They're efficient. They have technology. It's a very mature and sophisticated process. So if you don't want to create it in-house, send it and outsource it. The third way is to increase the maturity of existing processes that are existing within the company right now. So let's talk more about that. There are 7 steps to improve process maturity within a specific process that you have. So I'm going to go through all 7 steps, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. Step number 1 is to identify the best performer. So I'll give you an example. I had a client who was trying to improve customer retention and reduce customer churn. In analyzing his churn numbers, he noticed that majority of the churn happened in the first year. When he further analyzed and broke it down by quarter, he noticed that the majority of the first year churn, with customers leaving and canceling, occurred in the first 90 days. Useful insight. CEOs look at the big numbers and get more specific into trying to find root cause. This CEO went even further. He looked at his 4 or 5 person customer onboarding team and looked at the retention rates of the new customers that went through these various different employees. What he noticed was there was quite a bit of variance. One person, on that team performed a lot better than the other 3 or 4. The new customers that were onboarded by one individual, they tended to have a much better retention rate than the others. And so he was super curious. So he did step 1 of this process. He identified the best performer on a team. The second thing he did was to observe. What did she do differently than the other people on the team? Once he figured that out, he documented those findings. And then you want to switch everyone on that team to the new documented best practice. Step 5 is to hire and train new employees to use this process that is now documented, that is proven to work. And step 6 is to verify everyone is using the new process. Just because you figured out what works better, don't assume everyone's going to immediately embrace it. You need that verification process. This is the core 6 steps of improving a process. The 7th step is to experiment, to take 1 or 2 people on your team to try to find a better way of doing things, to find the next person that outperforms everybody else. And then you repeat the first 6 steps all over again. Okay? So I'll give you the insight for my client. What he noticed was that the onboarding specialist that outperformed all others, at least in this particular industry, for this particular company, for these kinds of customers, asked one question that the other 3 to 4 onboarding specialists did not. She asked the customer, what is your goal? What do you want to accomplish with our software? What would be a good win that if we achieved in the next 30 days, you would be thrilled? And then what she would do is she would simplify the training process to just teach the customer how to achieve his or her objective. All the other onboarding specialists were not asking about the goal and were teaching the customer how to do everything in their very sophisticated, very complicated software. What my client figured out was customers don't like feeling overwhelmed. And so the majority of customers were feeling overwhelmed by the power of what the software could do. And they didn't know where to start. It was too much. So what they did to get rid of that feeling of discomfort of being overwhelmed, they canceled the software subscription. So this doesn't mean this will always work. It doesn't mean it'll work in your business or your industry, but it's something to test. And more importantly, it is to have this process of experimentation, finding your winners, your process winners that are more effective, and then standardizing across that. So these are the 7 steps to improving process maturity of any process. And this is an essential CEO level skill. So we talked about the decision-making process as our first skill gap. Our second skill gap was process maturity. Now let's talk about the third skill gap I see between founders versus founders that make it to CEO. And that is disciplined execution. Let me define what I mean by that. So disciplined execution is the art and science of getting things done in an orderly way with consistent quality, quantity and timing. So here's the question. How do you create a disciplined execution in your business? Well, the answer is there's a process for that too. Are you seeing a theme here? There's a process to do these high-level skills. Let's talk about that. There are 6 steps to creating disciplined execution for every role in your company. The first thing you need are goals. Every role in your company requires a goal. Now imagine if you hired a bunch of archers and you don't give them targets with bullseyes to aim towards. If you don't give them something to aim for, you have no reasonable expectation that they should hit it. They've got to be able to know what they're aiming for and what they're trying to accomplish. The second thing you need is measurement. You need some way to tell your employees how close they are or are not to their goals. So if you have salespeople, they need a quota. If there's no quota, don't expect them to hit it. And if they have a quota, but you don't tell them what they've closed, they're kind of flying blind. It's like having a bunch of archers with a target in front of them, and then you blindfold them so that if they miss, they don't know. Did they miss to the right? Did they miss to the left? Were they too high or were they too low? Did they miss by a little or did they miss by a lot? Right? That feedback loop is important, and that feedback loop only exists if there's a measurement system in place for every role in your company. The third step you need to do is to create accountability. When somebody misses their goal, because now it's measured and tracked, when they miss their goal, someone else, management, executive management, the CEO, must notice. And something has to happen as a result of the miss. If people miss their targets and nothing happens as a result, people will keep missing their targets. It's just that simple. So one of 2 things has to happen. Either step 4, troubleshooting. You missed your sales target. How come? Let's investigate. That becomes a very important process. Or step 5, coaching. We know why you missed. You weren't doing it properly. Let me tell you how to do it better. You did it this way. I need you to do it that way. Here are the 3 specific things that's different between the way you did it versus the way I want you to do it. That's coaching. That too is a skill and is required in order to have disciplined execution in any particular role or any particular team. And the 6th step is to remove poor performers. Some people are just a mismatch for the role. They could be great at something else, but not this role. So if you've identified what's wrong, you tried to coach them, it's not effective, you got to remove them out of the role. As simple as that. Now, of this, number 4 is an interesting step, troubleshooting. I think a lot of founders miss this step and aren't really great at it. Sometimes when people miss, it's for reasons not directly within their control. So I'll give you sort of an oversimplified example. If you're talking to your sales team and you're head of sales and you realize every employee missed their sales quota in that team, you want to ask why. Maybe as you investigate or troubleshoot, you realize that the Salesforce.com system wasn't working properly, or the digital virtual telephone system was down, and so customers could call in, but the salespeople couldn't answer the phone for 5 days out of the month, and they missed their sales targets because of that. So in that case, by making the Salesforce accountable, they're going to identify obstacles that are elsewhere in the company. In this particular instance, the IT team not supporting the sales team properly. And then you can go troubleshoot that team to see if they have goals, if there's a way of measuring their progress against the goals, if there's accountability when they miss their target. So one of the great benefits of having accountability and putting pressure on teams to deliver is they will be very honest and candid about what's getting in their way because of the pressure. They're worried about getting fired, so they're very vocal about what else is wrong in the business. And it helps you fix problems that were otherwise beneath the surface and not quite so obvious. So this disciplined execution process either gives you great results or it flushes out the hidden problems in your company so they're above the surface and can be dealt with rather than hidden. If you don't hold people accountable, they won't tell you what else is wrong. And you'll just constantly miss for lots of different reasons and be inconsistent across the board. So disciplined execution is very, very important. Here's why some founders find disciplined execution difficult. A lot of people who become entrepreneurs and startup founders, they do so because they don't want to work for quote unquote the man, which is this metaphor for this higher authority figure that makes you show up on time, do things a certain way, and doesn't allow you to be creative. They just want you to do certain things a certain way. And then the great irony in all this is you become the startup founder, so you don't have to have all this rigid discipline. And if you're successful, you now have to become the CEO that now has to impose this discipline on everybody else. So if you don't like discipline, and that's why you're a founder, it's very challenging to make the leap to CEO because you have to use discipline constantly, day in, day out. Here's why discipline execution matters a lot. Disciplined execution leads to predictable and consistent results. This in turn leads to reducing risk, which leads to a higher valuation multiple. So the bottom line is you make more money when there's disciplined execution. So when you have outside investors, they want disciplined execution because they'll get a greater return on their investment. Now you as a shareholder are going to benefit a lot more at a certain stage when there's more disciplined execution in your business. Let's talk about skill gap number 4. So number 1 was the decision-making approach. Skill gap number 2 was process maturity. Skill gap number 3 is disciplined execution. Skill gap number 4 is compensating for weaknesses. Now, good CEOs are self-aware of their weaknesses. And there are 3 ways to compensate for your weakness. You can hire insiders to do the things you're bad at. You can hire outsiders in order to take care of those things you're poor at. Or you can work on improving your weaknesses. So let me stop here for a second. If you are bad at certain things, and by the way, every CEO is bad at something, even the successful ones. It's not that they're good at everything. It's that they realize what they are bad at, and they fill their gaps in this way. When I talk about this idea of these 4 skill gaps between founder and CEO, what a lot of founders have said to me after I sort of talk about this idea, they wonder if they should continue on in their company as the leader. If you're not great at process maturity, if the idea of disciplined execution makes you want to vomit, then you may not be the right person to become CEO of the business. And it might make sense for you to hire someone else to do that. Or if you are able to step back from your personal biases, maybe you personally don't like discipline, but the role of CEO requires discipline. And so if you're willing to let go of your past to become what the business needs now, you can also make that transition and stay on and become a founder-CEO. So that's a really fundamental question. You got to decide which path do you want. And to improve your weakness, it's really just 2 steps. Awareness of where you are weak, and then searching for some resource to compensate for where you're weak. So whether that is you're looking for a new hire to replace yourself as CEO, or maybe you're weak in finance, you want to hire a CFO, or you're weak in technology and you want to hire a chief technology officer. If that is what your weakness is, you'd want to do that probably sooner rather than later, right? For example, if you're not great in finance, you're probably going to need a finance resource earlier than other founders that have some background in finance. So what you need and when you need it is going to be determined in part by what you are weak at and what you are good at. So hiring outside vendors and consultants is also another resource and that good CEOs are always searching for. And the last one is learning resources. The good CEOs are frankly doing all 3 of these. They're constantly recruiting for new hires. They're constantly looking for suppliers and vendors and consultants that can fill certain gaps that they need at a moment in time. And they're always learning new skills in order to be more effective. Speaking of learning resources, I want to introduce you to the resource page at SaaSCEO.com. If you found today's video and presentation helpful, you're really going to love all the resources available at SaaSCEO.com/resources. Thanks for watching and have a great day.